You stand on a Cuban hillside in 1898 and the air tastes like iron and gunpowder. Below you, American soldiers charge up San Juan Hill, their blue uniforms darkening with sweat and blood. This isn't the glorious war the newspapers promised back home. This is chaos. This is terror. This is the moment when America stepped onto the world stage, not with fanfare, but with the screams of dying men echoing through tropical heat. Theodore Roosevelt leads his Rough Riders up the slope, but behind him, you see something the history books often forget. Black soldiers of the 10th Cavalry Regiment charge alongside, their courage unrecognized, their sacrifice unsung. They call them Buffalo Soldiers. In this moment, they're simply Americans bleeding for a cause they barely understand. What drives a man to charge into machine gun fire? Is it patriotism, fear of cowardice, or something deeper? The primal bond between soldiers who know that today, only today, they hold each other's lives in their hands. The Spanish defenders above have turned the hillside into a killing field. Every rock, every tree hides death. You watch as Private John Smith from Iowa, 19 years old, engaged to be married, takes 3 bullets to the chest. He falls, forward, his fingers clawing at Cuban soil he's never seen before this day. His last words aren't about glory or country. He whispers his mother's name. This war started with an explosion. The USS Maine, resting in Havana Harbor, torn apart in the night. 266 American sailors died in an instant. "Remember the Maine" became the battle cry. But here's what they don't tell you. We still don't know for certain what caused that explosion. An accident? Spanish sabotage? A convenient excuse for a nation hungry for empire? You're witnessing the birth of American imperialism, painted in blood on these Cuban hills. The newspapers back home, especially William Randolph Hearst's journals, have whipped the public into a frenzy with tales of Spanish atrocities. Some are true, many are exaggerated. All serve a purpose: to justify what's happening on this hillside where boys from Nebraska farms and New York tenements gasp their last breaths in foreign mud. The charge continues. Men fall like wheat before a scythe. Yet they keep climbing. These Americans driven by something beyond reason. You see Sergeant James Robinson, a Buffalo soldier from Alabama, drag 3 wounded white soldiers to safety, one after another, under constant fire. No one will give him a medal. His name won't appear in the dispatches. But on this hill in this moment, he's redefining what it means to be an American hero. The irony cuts deep. These black soldiers fight for a nation that denies them basics, rights at home. They charge up this hill to free Cuba from Spanish oppression, while their own families face lynching and segregation. What kind of courage does it take to fight for a country that barely acknowledges your humanity? As the Americans finally crest the hill, Spanish positions crumbling, you realize you're watching more than a battle. You're watching America transform, from an isolated nation into a global power. The cost? Look at the bodies scattered across the slope. Count them if you can. Each one represents a family back home that will receive a telegram beginning with, "We regret to inform you." This is how empires are born. Not in glory, but in the space between a mother's prayer and a soldier's final breath. The war didn't start on San Juan Hill. It started in the hearts of ambitious men in Washington boardrooms and newspaper offices. You need to understand this. The Spanish-American War was America's first media war, crafted and sold to the public like a product. Picture William Randolph Hearst in his New York office, cigars smoke curling around his head as he reviews the latest dispatches from Cuba. His reporters send him facts, he transforms them into sensation. "You furnish the pictures," he allegedly told artist Frederick Remington, "and I'll furnish the war." Whether he actually said these words doesn't matter. He lived them. The competition between Hearst's New York Journal and Joseph Pulitzer's New York World created what we now call yellow journalism. They painted the Spanish as monsters, Cuban rebels as freedom fighters, and American intervention as divine destiny. Truth became casualty long before the first shot was fired. But here's what the newspapers didn't print. American businesses had invested millions in Cuban sugar plantations. The Cuban rebellion against Spain threatened these investments. When you follow the money, the noble crusade for Cuban freedom starts to look different. Those brave soldiers charging up San Juan Hill? They're fighting for Standard Oil and American Sugar Refining Company as much as they're fighting for liberty. President William McKinley didn't want this war. You can see him in the White House, pacing, praying, agonizing over the decision. He's a Civil War veteran. He knows what war really means. Not the sanitized version in newspapers, but the stench of gangrene, the screams of the maimed, the weight of sending young men to die. But the pressure mounts. Congress, inflamed by yellow journalism, demands action. The business community wants its Cuban investments protected. The public, fed a steady diet of Spanish atrocities, cries for vengeance. When the Maine explodes in Havana Harbor on February 15, 1898, McKinley's hand is forced. The investigation will be inconclusive, but that doesn't matter. Hearst's journal dedicates 8 pages to the explosion, inventing details where facts are scarce. Spanish treachery, the headlines scream. Sales soar. War becomes inevitable. You want to know the real tragedy? Spain was already losing. The Cuban rebels had them on the ropes. Spain was ready to negotiate, possibly even grant Cuban independence. But that wasn't enough for the forces pushing America toward war. They didn't want Cuban independence. They wanted American dominance. On April 25, 1898, Congress declares war. Across America, young men flood recruiting stations. They've read about Spanish concentration camps in Cuba, about starving reconcentrados, about rape and murder. The stories are partly true. Spanish General Weyler's policies are brutal. But the volunteers don't know that American forces will soon implement similar tactics in the Philippines. Today's liberators become tomorrow's oppressors. That's the arithmetic of empire. Theodore Roosevelt resigns as Assistant Secretary of the Navy to form his Rough Riders. He understands something fundamental. War makes political careers. While President McKinley agonizes, Roosevelt exults. He sees glory where others see graves. He'll charge up San Juan Hill and ride that charge all the way to the White House. In Tampa, Florida, soldiers gather for embarkation to Cuba. The scene is chaos, a nation unprepared for war trying to project power across the Caribbean. Blacks. Regiments camp separately from white ones. Jim Crow follows the flag. The 9th and 10th Cavalry, Buffalo soldiers with decades of frontier fighting experience, are given the worst equipment, the worst positions on transport ships. Yet, when the ITU bullets fly, they'll be expected to die just as bravely as their white counterparts. Have you ever been seasick while fearing for your life? That's what thousands of American soldiers experience as they cross the 90 miles from Florida to Cuba. The ships are overcrowded, undersupplied, and unsuited for tropical warfare. Horses and men share the same stifling holds. Disease spreads faster than news of home. Private William Johnson from Minnesota writes to his sweetheart, "The ocean is beautiful, but I can't enjoy it. Men are sick everywhere. The smell, I can't describe. We're packed like cattle. They say we're heroes, but we feel like cargo." The American military in 1898 is a contradiction. Ambitious in vision, amateur in execution. The regular army numbers only 25,000 men before the war. Within weeks, it must expand to over 270,000. Imagine trying to train, equip, and transport a force 10 times your size with no real experience in overseas operations. Chaos isn't a possibility. It's a certainty. The logistics alone would be comic if they weren't so deadly. Soldiers headed for tropical Cuba are issued heavy wool uniforms suitable for Montana winters. The Army contracts for tons of beef that arrives rotten, embalmed beef, the soldiers call it, convinced it's been chemically treated to hide putrefaction. More men will die from disease and food poisoning than from Spanish bullets. On June 22, 1898, the American invasion force lands at Decury and Siboney, east of Santiago. The landing is unopposed. The Spanish have withdrawn to prepared positions. It's a gift the Americans nearly squander through sheer incompetence. Units land without orders, supplies pile up on the beach, and command structure dissolves into suggestions rather than orders. You watch as regular army troops eye Roosevelt's Rough Riders with skepticism. These volunteers include Ivy League athletes, Western cowboys, and Native American scouts, a publicity stunt masquerading as a military unit. Yet under fire, they'll prove themselves. War has a way of stripping away pretense, revealing who men really are beneath their uniforms. The march from the coast to Santiago becomes a preview of horrors to come. The Cuban jungle doesn't welcome invaders. Heat and humidity turn uniforms into steam baths. Mosquitoes carry yellow fever and malaria. Men who are healthy at dawn are delirious with fever by dusk. The medical corps, understaffed and under-equipped, can offer little more than prayers. Clara Barton arrives with the Red Cross, one of the few bright spots in this logistical nightmare. At 77 years old, she works tirelessly, distributing supplies the Army should have provided. She sees what the newspapers won't report: young Americans dying not from heroic charges but from preventable diseases, their bodies racked with dysentery, their lips cracked with fever. The Spanish, meanwhile, wait in their fortifications around Santiago. They're outnumbered but not outmatched. They have modern Mauser rifles, smokeless powder, and the advantage of prepared positions. They know the Americans must come to them, must charge across open ground under the Cuban sun. They've turned the approaches to Santiago into killing fields. General William Shafter commands the American forces. At 300 pounds, suffering from gout, he can barely mount a horse. He directs the campaign from a cot, maps spread across his swollen belly. This is American military leadership in 1898. Brave men led by commanders who belong in hospitals, not headquarters. The night before the assault on San Juan Heights, you can feel the tension in the American camps. Veterans of the Indian Wars share cigarettes with farm boys who've never fired a shot in anger. Tomorrow they'll charge fortified positions defended by an enemy they've been taught to despise but have never met. How many writing letters home tonight will never write another? Dawn breaks on July 1st, 1898. The day that will define the war has arrived. As American forces prepare to assault the San Juan Heights, you need to understand the human cost about to be paid. Each soldier checking his rifle, each cavalryman tightening his saddle, represents a universe of hopes and fears about to collide with Spanish steel. The battle plan is simple to the point of stupidity: frontal assaults against fortified positions. It's a tactic from the Civil War, but the Spanish have modern rifles and smokeless powder. They can kill without revealing their positions. The Americans, still using black powder Springfield rifles, announce their location with every shot. Lieutenant John J. Pershing, yes, the same Pershing who will lead American forces in World War I, commands a unit of Buffalo soldiers. He watches his men prepare, knowing that military segregation means they receive inferior equipment and no recognition, yet they'll be expected to match anyone's courage. They fought like demons, he'll write later, but his praise won't translate into equality. The signal comes. Thousands of Americans begin their advance. Within minutes, the careful battle plans dissolve. Units intermingle, officers fall, command structure collapses. What remains is raw courage and the primitive urge to survive by moving forward. You're with Private Samuel Cooper of the 71st New York as he struggles through the jungle toward San Juan Hill. Spanish Mauser bullets crack overhead, that distinctive sound soldiers never forget. Men fall around him, some silently, some screaming. Cooper steps over a sergeant he shared coffee with that morning, trying not to look at where the man's jaw used to be. The Rough Riders, dismounted and fighting as infantry, struggle up Kettle Hill. Roosevelt, conspicuous on horseback, seems to bear a charmed life as bullets wind past. But look closer. For every story of Roosevelt's glory, there are a dozen untold tragedies. Corporal David Sanchez, one of the few Hispanic Rough Riders, takes a bullet meant for a wounded comrade. His sacrifice goes unrecorded in the official histories. On the American right, the all-black 9th and 10th Cavalry regiments advance without fanfare but with devastating effect. Private George Berry of the 10th Cavalry seizes the regimental colors when the bearer falls. He plants them on San Juan Hill, a black soldier claiming American victory on foreign soil. The symbolism is lost on a nation that won't grant him the right to vote in most states. The heat becomes another enemy. Men collapse from exhaustion, their tongues swollen, their vision blurring. Water carriers become targets for Spanish sharpshooters who understand that thirst kills as surely as bullets. You watch Corporal James Mitchell crawl 50 yards under fire to bring water to wounded men. A Spanish bullet finds him on the return trip. The men he saved will die of thirst anyway. By afternoon, American forces have taken the heights, but at what cost? Bodies litter the slopes. American and Spanish, black and white, regular and volunteer. In death, they achieve the equality denied them in life. The flies have already found them, beginning nature's cleanup of humanity's mess. Roosevelt will become the hero of San Juan Hill in American mythology, but the real story is more complex. Success comes not from individual glory, but from collective sacrifice. The Buffalo Soldiers who opened the way for the Rough Riders' advance receive footnotes instead of headlines. The regular army units that bore the heaviest casualties fade into historical obscurity. As night falls on July 1st, American forces dig in on the captured heights. They can see Santiago below, but the city hasn't fallen. The Spanish still have fight in them. In the makeshift field hospitals, surgeons work by lamplight, sawing through bones, desperately trying to save lives with techniques barely advanced from the Civil War. You sit with dying men as they ramble about home, their minds retreating to safer places as their bodies fail. Private Thomas Anderson calls for his mother in German, the language of his childhood. Sergeant William Davis recites Bible verses his grandmother taught him, finding comfort in words as his blood soaks into foreign soil. These are the victories newspapers don't report, the small triumphs of human dignity in the face of annihilation. The guns fall silent on San Juan Heights, but the dying continues. You need to understand something about war that newspapers never capture. The aftermath is often worse than the battle. As American forces consolidate their positions around Santiago, the real enemy reveals itself: disease. Yellow fever arrives like divine judgment. It doesn't care about uniform color or national allegiance. The same mosquitoes that tormented soldiers on the march now carry death in their tiny bodies. Men who survived Spanish bullets succumb to microscopic killers. The hospitals overflow. Then the graveyards. Dr. Walter Reed hasn't yet made his breakthrough discovery about mosquito transmission. The medical corps fights blind against an invisible enemy. They blame bad air, contaminated water, moral weakness, everything but the true culprit swarming around their patients. You watch nurses and doctors fall ill trying to save men they're inadvertently killing with their ignorance. In Santiago Harbor, the Spanish fleet makes its desperate run for freedom on July 3rd. Admiral Cervera knows it's suicide, but orders are orders. The American Navy waits like predators at a waterhole. Within hours, the entire Spanish squadron lies burning or beached. Sailors who were enemies at dawn rescue each other from burning waters by noon. The naval battle provides the decisive blow, but tell that to the soldiers still dying in field hospitals. Victory speeches don't cure dysentery. Patriotic fervor doesn't stop the fever dreams where men relive their worst moments on endless loop. Back home, Americans celebrate. Newspapers print special editions. Hearst takes personal credit for the victory, as if his ink-stained fingers pulled triggers on San Juan Hill. The yellow press that helped start the war now works overtime to glorify it. They print casualty lists in small type while headlines scream of glory. But in Cuba, the reality grinding on. The siege of Santiago continues for 2 more weeks. Spanish soldiers and Cuban civilians starve together. American forces, supposedly there to liberate Cuba, find themselves enforcing a blockade that kills innocents alongside combatants. This is the arithmetic of siege warfare. Multiply military objectives by civilian casualties. You stand with Lieutenant Andrew Rowan, the man who carried the famous message to Garcia as he watches Cuban children beg for food outside American lines. These are the people America came to save, reduced to skeletal figures with distended bellies. Rowan shares his rations, knowing it's a drop in an ocean of hunger. The liberation of Cuba looks suspiciously like its destruction. On July 17, Santiago surrenders. Spanish Commander General Toral facing starvation and disease among his troops, accepts the inevitable. The formal ceremony maintains military dignity while hiding the informal reality. Broken men surrendering to equally broken victors. Theodore Roosevelt, already planning his political future, ensures photographers capture him at every opportunity. But look at the faces of the men around him. They've aged years in weeks. Private Joseph Miller, 19 when he enlisted, looks 40. His eyes have seen too much. He'll return to his Iowa farm, but part of him will always remain on those Cuban hills. The Buffalo soldiers, instrumental in victory, face a bitter irony. In Cuba, they fought as equals. Returning to America, they'll ride in segregated train, cars, barred from the victory parades in many cities. Private George Berry, who planted the flag on San Juan Hill, will be refused service in restaurants that celebrate the war he helped win. As American forces occupy Santiago, the cultural collision intensifies. Soldiers raised on Protestant hymns encounter a Catholic culture they've been taught to distrust. The liberation feels increasingly like occupation. Cuban rebels, who fought Spain for years, watch their American allies take control with growing resentment. Disease continues its grim harvest. By late July, over 4,000 American soldiers are sick. The death rate from disease outpaces combat casualties by 4 to 1. General Shafter, himself prostrate with fever, cables Washington, "The army must be moved or it will perish." August 1898 brings a crisis that newspapers barely mention. The American army in Cuba is disintegrating, not from enemy action but from microscopic assassins. You walk through the camps outside Santiago and witness scenes from Dante's Inferno. Reimagined in tropical heat, the field hospitals have become death traps. Soldiers who enter with minor wounds exit in coffins if they exit at all. Typhoid, malaria, yellow fever, dysentery. The four horsemen of tropical warfare ride unopposed through American ranks. Nurses work until they collapse, then become patients themselves. Colonel Theodore Roosevelt, his glory secured, writes a letter that could end his career. Along with other officers, he signs the round-robin letter, demanding immediate evacuation of troops from Cuba. The army is ripe for dying like rotten sheep, he writes. It's an act of moral courage that surpasses his physical bravery on San Juan Hill, though it won't make the same headlines. The evacuation becomes another logistical nightmare. Ships arrive without medical facilities. Sick and healthy soldiers crowd together, ensuring disease spreads to those who've somehow avoided it. The voyage home becomes a floating pestilence, men dying within sight of American shores. At Montauk Point, Long Island, the Army establishes Camp Wyckoff to quarantine returning troops. It's America's first glimpse of war's true face. Skeletal. Soldiers stumble off ships, their uniforms hanging on wasted frames. Reporters expecting to interview heroes find instead hollow-eyed survivors who speak in whispers about friends left in Cuban graves. The families who gather at Montauk expecting reunions often find funerals. Mary Anderson travels from Nebraska to see her son, the one who wrote such cheerful letters about serving his country. She finds him delirious with fever, unable to recognize her. He dies holding her hand, another casualty of a war already being mythologized as a splendid little adventure. Meanwhile, in the Philippines, the dark sequel to Cuban liberation unfolds. Admiral Dewey's victory in Manila Bay was supposed to be another easy triumph. Instead, it becomes a preview of American empire's true cost. Filipino insurgents, thinking Americans came as liberators, discover they've merely exchanged Spanish masters for American ones. Emilio Aguinaldo, leader of the Philippine independence movement, watches with growing alarm as American forces entrench themselves in Manila. The same rhetoric used to justify freeing Cuba from Spain now justifies keeping the Philippines under American control. The liberators become occupiers with breathtaking speed. You need to understand this transformation. In Washington, men who spoke of Cuban freedom now discuss the Philippines in terms of markets and naval bases. President McKinley claims God told him to uplift and civilize the Filipinos. It's white man's burden dressed in American clothing. Imperialism justified by prayer. The Treaty of Paris negotiations reveal the war's true nature. Spain cedes Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to America. Cuba gains nominal independence but under American oversight. The Monroe Doctrine, once about keeping Europe out of the Americas, now justifies American expansion across the Pacific. Back home, the anti-imperialist movement gains strength. Mark Twain, Andrew Carnegie, and others argue that empire betrays American principles. They point out the hypocrisy of fighting to free Cuba while subjugating the Philippines, but their voices drown in the chorus of manifest destiny and racial superiority that justifies American expansion. The soldiers who survived Cuba scatter across America, carrying their stories. Some, like Roosevelt, parlay military service into political power. Others, particularly the Buffalo Soldiers, return to a nation that denies them basic rights despite their sacrifice. Private First Class William Carney, who earned the Medal of Honor in an earlier war, works as a mail carrier because no other job will hire a black hero. In military hospitals, the last casualties of the Spanish-American War fight lonely battles. Soldiers who charged up San Juan Hill now struggle to climb stairs, their bodies permanently weakened by tropical diseases. The government that sent them to war haggles over disability payments. Glory is for headlines. Aftermath is for actuaries. February 1899. The Spanish-American War officially ended 2 months ago, but in the Philippines the real war has just begun. You stand in the streets of Manila as American soldiers fire on their former allies, Filipino insurgents who helped defeat Spain. The liberators have become conquerors and the conquered refuse to submit. This is the war America doesn't want to acknowledge. The Philippine-American War that will rage for 3 years, claim over 200,000 Filipino lives, and expose the dark heart of American imperialism. The same soldiers who freed Cuba now burn Filipino villages, implement concentration camps, and use torture techniques that would shame the Spanish they defeated. Private William Grayson of the 1st Nebraska Volunteers fires the first shots on February 4th, killing 2 Filipino soldiers. I didn't know whether they were insurgents or not, he later admits. It doesn't matter. The war needs a beginning, and dead Filipinos serve as well as any excuse. General Elwell Otis commands American forces with a combination of incompetence and brutality that makes General Shafter look like Napoleon. He censors journalists, lies to Washington about the situation, and unleashes a campaign that transforms American soldiers into the oppressors they once fought. You want to know how liberators become killers? Watch Sergeant Michael O'Brien of the 3rd Artillery, a decent man from Boston who enlisted to free Cuba. In the Philippines, he participates in the burning of entire villages suspected of supporting insurgents. We were told they were savages, he writes home. But who are the savages now? The water cure. That's what they call it when American soldiers force water down Filipino prisoners' throats until their stomachs distend, then jump on them. It's torture by any definition, but military reports describe it as rigorous interrogation. The Spanish atrocities that justified the war in Cuba pale beside American atrocities in the Philippines. Major Littleton Waller of the Marine Corps receives orders to turn the island of Samar into a howling wilderness. He follows them with enthusiasm, killing every male over 10 in designated areas. When news of the massacre reaches America, briefly penetrating military censorship, the public response is muted. Brown lives in far-off islands matter less than white lives in nearby Cuba. But here's what the racial arithmetic misses. American soldiers die too. The Philippines become a jungle hell where ambush waits behind every tree, where yesterday's friendly villager becomes today's assassin. Paranoia replaces patriotism. Survival justifies any atrocity. Corporal Daniel Evans writes to his sister, "We came here to do good, but we're doing evil. I've seen things, done things, that would make you ashamed to be my sister. They say we're civilizing these people, but we're becoming barbarians." The insurgents, led by Aguinaldo, fight with desperate courage. They can't match American firepower, so they turn to guerrilla warfare. Every American patrol risks ambush. Every friendly Filipino might carry a hidden bolo knife. The conventional war American forces trained for dissolves into a nightmare of shadows and suspicion. In Washington, the anti-imperialist movement gains converts as reports filter back from the Philippines, but President McKinley, re-elected on the glory of defeating Spain, refuses to acknowledge the disaster unfolding. The Philippines are America's gateway to Asian markets, he insists. The cost in blood, Filipino and American, is worth the commercial gain. Mark Twain writes with bitter sarcasm, "We have pacified some thousands of the islanders and buried them, destroyed their fields, burned their villages, and turned their widows and orphans out of doors. And so by these providences of God, and the phrase is the government's not mine, we are a world power." You see the transformation in individual soldiers. Lieutenant William Calley, a different one from the My Lai massacre, arrives in the Philippines full of idealism about America's civilizing mission. Within months, he's ordering the execution of prisoners, burning crops to starve insurgents, implementing the same policies that outraged Americans when Spain used them in Cuba. The year 1900 brings no peace to the Philippines. Instead, the war metastasizes into something darker. You witness the birth of American counterinsurgency doctrine, written in Filipino blood and American shame. What started as liberation has become subjugation on an industrial scale. General Arthur MacArthur, father of Douglas, implements a policy of concentration camps, protected zones, where Filipino civilians are herded to separate them from insurgents. Sound familiar? It should. These are the same reconcentrado camps that outraged Americans when Spain created them in Cuba, but when America does it, they're humanitarian measures. Inside these camps, you see starvation and disease claim more lives than bullets ever could. Children with distended bellies, mothers trying to nurse babies with milk their starved bodies can't produce. Old men dying quietly in corners, their dignity the last thing the war takes from them. Private First Class Jacob Smith from Ohio guards one of these camps. He enlisted to fight for freedom. Now he watches freedom die daily in the eyes of imprisoned civilians. "We've become everything we said we hated about the Spanish," he writes in a letter home that military censors will never let through. The insurgents respond with increased brutality. American soldiers captured face torture and mutilation. The cycle of atrocity spins faster. Each side justifies its barbarism by pointing to the others. Humanity drowns in an ocean of reciprocal hatred. You follow a patrol from the 9th Infantry into the jungle. These men, veterans of the Indian Wars in Cuba, think they've seen everything. But the Philippines teach new lessons in horror. Private Tom Washington steps on a bamboo spike smeared with human feces, a simple but effective insurgent weapon. He'll die of infection 2 weeks later, screaming about the smell of his own rotting flesh. Back in America, the 1900 election becomes a referendum on empire. William Jennings. Bryan challenges McKinley, making anti-imperialism a campaign issue. But prosperity at home muffles protests about atrocities abroad. McKinley wins decisively. The American people, it seems, have chosen empire over principle. In the Philippines, the war grows more savage. General Jacob Smith issues his infamous order regarding Samar. "I want no prisoners. I wish you to kill and burn. The more you kill and burn, the better it will please me. I want all persons killed who are capable of bearing arms in actual hostilities against the United States." When asked to clarify the age limit, Smith replies, 10 years and up, 10 years old. Children who should be learning to read become legitimate military targets. This is what American liberation looks like in 1900. This is the freedom delivered at gunpoint. But resistance to the war grows within military ranks. Captain John Jordan refuses to burn a village he knows contains only women and children. Court-martialed. For insubordination, he tells the tribunal, "I joined the army to serve my country, not to murder innocents. If that makes me a traitor, then I accept the label with pride." The Buffalo Soldiers find themselves in a particular hell. Sent to the Philippines after Cuba, they face a terrible irony. Brown men from a nation that denies them equality are ordered to kill other brown men seeking freedom, some desert to join the insurgents, forming the celebrated San Patricio Battalion of American defectors. David Fagan, a corporal in the 24th Infantry, becomes the most famous defector. This black soldier from Florida finds more respect among Filipino insurgents than he ever did in the American Army. He rises to captain in Aguinaldo's forces, leading successful raids against his former comrades. The price on his head, $600, exceeds that of most Filipino generals. You want to understand empire? Watch Sergeant Patrick O'Malley, son of Irish immigrants who fled British oppression, as he burns Filipino homes on orders. Watch him pause, recognizing something familiar in the eyes of the dispossessed. The oppressed becoming oppressors. It's history's cruelest joke, and America writes the punchline in the Philippines. March 23, 1901. In a small town in the Philippines, American forces capture Emilio Aguinaldo through treachery disguised as tactics. General Frederick Funston leads Macabebe scouts, Filipinos who sided with America, in a deception operation. They pose as prisoners, gain access to Aguinaldo's camp, then reveal their true allegiance. The leader of Philippine independence becomes a prisoner of the empire he fought. Aguinaldo's capture should end the war. It doesn't. Like cutting off a hydra's head, it only multiplies resistance. Local commanders continue fighting. The war becomes 1,000 small wars, each village a battlefield, every Filipino a potential enemy or ally. You need to see what pacification really means. In Batangas province, General Franklin Bell implements a scorched earth policy that would make Sherman's march look gentle. He creates concentration camps for entire populations, burns crops, slaughters livestock. To combat such a population, he declares, it is necessary to make the state of war as insupportable as possible. By insupportable, he means starvation. Within months, 1/6 of Batangas' population is dead. That's over 100,000 civilians, men, women, children, killed not by bullets, but by American policy. The same nation that went to war over Spanish atrocities commits worse atrocities to maintain its conquest. Private Charles Fulton from Vermont serves in Bell's campaign. He writes home describing the horror. We make the Spanish look like amateurs in cruelty. Yesterday we burned a village where insurgents might have hidden. Might have. We didn't check. The screams of trapped families. I can't sleep anymore. But some Americans resist their transformation into monsters. Lieutenant Eli Helmick refuses orders to execute prisoners. Court-martialed, he defends himself. I will not dishonor my uniform or my country by committing murder, regardless of orders. He's convicted, but his words echo through the ranks, reminding soldiers of the principles they've abandoned. The torture continues. The water cure becomes routine interrogation. Soldiers matter-of-factly describe forcing salt water into prisoners, hanging them by their thumbs, applying hot irons to feet. Military reports sanitize these horrors with bureaucratic language. Enhanced interrogation yields actionable intelligence. In Washington, Senate hearings on Philippine atrocities begin. Soldiers testify about massacres, torture, and concentration camps. The American public, confronted with evidence of their nation's brutality, largely shrugs. The Philippines are far away. The victims aren't white. Business interests trump humanitarian concerns. Senator George Hoar of Massachusetts emerges as the conscience of the nation, declaring, "We have sacrificed nearly 10,000 American lives, the flower of our youth. We have devastated provinces. We have slain uncounted thousands of the people you desire to benefit. Your practical statesmanship has succeeded in converting a people who 3 years ago were ready to kiss the hem of the garment of the American and to welcome him as liberator, into sullen and irreconcilable enemies, possessed of a hatred which centuries cannot eradicate." But Hoar's voice drowns in the chorus of manifest destiny. The Philippines offer naval bases, commercial opportunities, a stepping stone to Chinese markets. What are Filipino lives against such possibilities? President McKinley is assassinated in September 1901, making Theodore Roosevelt president. The hero of San Juan Hill now presides over an empire built on the bones of those who sought the same freedom Americans once claimed from Britain. The irony is lost on Roosevelt, who sees American expansion as the natural order of superior civilization spreading its benefits. On July 4, 1902, Roosevelt declares the Philippine-American War officially over. It's a lie wrapped in a holiday. Fighting continues for years. The Moro Rebellion in the southern Philippines will rage until 1913. But America needs victory for its national narrative, so victory is declared regardless of reality. The final toll? Over 4,000 American soldiers dead, mostly from disease. At least 20,000 Filipino combatants killed. And civilians? Conservative estimates say 200,000. Some historians argue for numbers 3 times higher. An entire generation of Filipinos sacrificed on the altar of American empire. You stand now at the crossroads of history, where past meets present, where the blood on Cuban hills and Philippine fields still stains the American story. What have you witnessed? The birth of an empire that would shape the century to come, midwifed by suffering and swaddled in hypocrisy. Remember Private William Johnson from Minnesota, seasick on the transport to Cuba? He survived San Juan Hill only to die of yellow fever 3 weeks later. His sweetheart married another man who never knew the taste of foreign dirt mixed with blood. Johnson's sacrifice built the foundation of American power, but his name appears on no monuments. Think of the Buffalo Soldiers who charged up San Juan Hill, proving their courage to a nation that wouldn't acknowledge their humanity. They returned to an America where their uniforms meant nothing against the color of their skin. Private George Berry, who planted the flag on Concord Heights, spent his last years fighting for the right to vote in the nation he helped make a world power. He died in 1902, killed by tuberculosis contracted in Cuba, never seeing the equality he fought to earn. Consider the transformation of ordinary men into instruments of empire. Corporal Daniel Evans, who wrote to his sister about becoming a barbarian in the Philippines, returned home broken in ways no medicine could heal. He drank himself to death by 1905, haunted by the faces of Filipino children in burning villages. His sister kept his letters, testament to how empires corrupt even their builders. The Spanish-American War lasted just 113 days, but its echoes reverberate through every American military intervention since. The pattern established in 1898, manufactured outrage, media manipulation, liberation turning to occupation, would replay in Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. Different enemies, same playbook. We never learn because we never remember. Theodore Roosevelt wrote his Rough Rider fame to the presidency, but what of the men who rode beside him? Most disappeared into history's margins, their stories untold. Trooper Frank Knox died in a veteran's home, raving about Spanish bullets that existed only in his shattered mind. Sergeant James Robinson, the Buffalo Soldier who saved 3 white comrades on San Juan Hill, worked as a janitor until arthritis in his Cuban souvenir crippled his hands. The Philippines became America's tutorial in empire management. Every counterinsurgency technique, every Hearts and Minds campaign, every strategic Hamlet program traces its ancestry to those jungle years. When you see American soldiers in distant lands, fighting enemies who fade into civilian populations, you're watching the Philippine script rewritten for new stages. What did we gain? Naval bases that projected power across the Pacific, commercial markets that enriched American businesses, strategic positions that would matter in wars not yet imagined. The architects of empire counted these as victories. What did we lose? The innocence of a nation that once defined itself by opposition to empire. The moral clarity that let Americans condemn European colonialism while building their own. Most precious of all, the lives and souls of those who learned that freedom, imposed by force, is just another name for slavery. Here's the truth they don't teach in schools. Every empire believes itself exceptional. Every conqueror thinks they're different from those who came before. Americans in 1898 told themselves they weren't like the Spanish, the British, the French. They were bringing democracy, civilization, progress. The same lies empires always tell dressed in new flags. But individual courage transcends national hypocrisy. Remember Lieutenant Eli Helmick, who refused to execute prisoners, Captain John Jordan, who wouldn't burn villages, David Fagan, who chose Filipino freedom over American racism. These men remind us that even in empire's machinery, human conscience can resist. The Spanish-American War made America a world power, but power without principle is just sophisticated barbarism. We gained an empire and lost our soul. That's the trade-off nations make when they choose conquest over compassion, expansion over ethics. Today, when politicians speak of American greatness, remember the price others paid for that greatness. When flags wave and patriots cheer, hear. Also the silence of the graves, Cuban, Filipino, American, that mark empire's true borders. Glory fades, power shifts. But the dead remain dead forever. You've journeyed through America's imperial birth, seen heroes and villains wear the same uniforms, witnessed liberation become oppression with breathtaking speed. What will you do with this knowledge? How will you respond when your nation next claims to fight for freedom while building empire? The answer matters. Because empires rise and fall, but the human capacity for both cruelty and compassion remains constant. In every generation, in every war, individuals choose between conscience and conformity, between humanity and nationality. The Spanish-American War teaches us that these choices echo through history, shaping futures not yet imagined. Remember the forgotten. Honor the sacrificed. Question the powerful. And when your leaders next speak of spreading freedom through force, ask yourself, whose freedom? At what cost? And who pays the price? Like the video, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Do you have family members who served in these forgotten conflicts? What stories have been passed down? What lessons learned? This channel exists for those who believe history is made not only by armies, but by individual courage in the face of empire's demands. Your stories matter. Your memories preserve what official histories erase. Share them, so that the true cost of power is never forgotten.